Hello and welcome. I'm Vincent Makori. This is Africa 54. We begin at the United Nations, where a threat to world peace, a menacing health pandemic, and the impact of climate change have topped the agenda this week at the UN General Assembly. African leaders that have addressed the UNGA have all echoed similar concerns. The United Nations General Assembly is taking place in the backdrop of a world under threat from brutal extremist groups such as ISIS or ISIL, Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, and a menacing health pandemic ravaging West African nations, Ebola. While addressing a variety of other issues, most of the African leaders who have spoken at the United Nations General Assembly seem to be speaking from the same page on the biggest threat on the continent today, Ebola. South African President Jacob Zuma said his country is willing to help wherever needed, adding that the crisis has been exacerbated by economic underdevelopment.
We believe that Ebola would have been contained within a few days had it been an outbreak in the developed world. But it has become a pandemic that threatens the economies of affected African states. The outbreak has thus exposed the challenges of capacity, lack of infrastructure, and other limited resources in Africa.
Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta said his country's troops will keep fighting Islamist militants in Somalia until peace and stability is restored to the region. He reminded the world that his country continues to sacrifice lives and resources in an effort to bring peace to Somalia. Militants belonging to Somalia's Al-Qaeda-allied Al-Shabaab attacked Nairobi's upmarket Westgate shopping mall on September 21, 2013, killing at least 67 people in an attack that evolved into a 4-day siege. But Kenyatta also addressed the Ebola crisis. He said Kenya has given $1 million to combat the Ebola virus in West Africa.
Beyond the tragedy of the thousands who have lost lives and loved ones, and the many more living with a threat, livelihoods and businesses have collapsed, and aspirations for shared prosperity continue to shrink day by day. Kenya stands in solidarity with the countries affected by this devastating virus.
Nigeria's President Goodluck Jonathan chose to focus the bulk of his address to the United Nations on development, but could not avoid addressing the threat in his own country, Boko Haram, which continues to kill and kidnap people in northeastern Nigeria. Jonathan, who has been criticized for his handling of the terrorist group, especially after it kidnapped over 200 schoolgirls 3 months ago, asserted that his government is determined to rescue and reunite the girls with their families. However, Mr. Jonathan took a swipe at the United Nations system.
From science and today's challenges can only be resolved by a Security Council whose working methods engender transparency, inclusivity, and common ownership through equitable representation of all regions in the decision-making process of the Council.
The speeches by world leaders continue and will conclude on Tuesday, September 30th. Well, for more perspective on the activities at the UNGA, we're joined by VOA UN correspondent Margaret Besheer. Margaret, we ended our story there with President Goodluck Jonathan saying there is need to be more inclusive at the UN Security Council. This is a call that comes every year, isn't it so?
Well, it's called Security Council reform, and countries have been calling for it for 2 decades at least. And I think it's sort of a case of the haves and the have-nots. You know, there are 5 countries who are permanently on the Security Council, and they pretty much have the power, and that's the US, China, Britain, Russia, and France. And there are 10 countries that rotate on and off for 2 years each. And so the other countries are saying, you know, the world has changed since World War II when the UN was set up. The UN will be 70 years old next year, in fact. So they're saying you really need to change representation in the Security Council to reflect that. And they would like to see it expanded. I mean, maybe not a council of 15 members, but perhaps one of 20 or even 25 members. You know, but where does it start getting unruly, you know, with too many members? So, but it's something that's been discussed here for years, and I think it's going to continue to be discussed. I don't think it will be resolved resolved soon. But Africa wants a permanent seat. Latin America wants a permanent seat. Germany thinks it should have a permanent seat. Japan, you know, there are certain countries that think they should have a permanent seat. And veto, and that's the other issue, is veto.
Yeah, and the table remains small. But Margaret, leaders are still talking. There was a significant speech by an African president, the president of Guinea. Give us some details.
Yes, we just heard from him a short while ago. As you could expect, he spoke a lot about Ebola. He said that there have been 2,500 victims so far in Guinea, and that there really needs to be an international global response to the crisis. But he also said that we have to confront sort of the irrational panic over Ebola, that it can be cured, and that we have to, you know, adjust our hygiene and things like this, so that, and burial practices and such, so that we won't be spreading the disease and people won't become infected. So he spoke about that, but he also went beyond Ebola, and he talked about the Millennium Development Goals, where Guinea has made progress, where it needs to, said on illiteracy, for instance, has gone down in Guinea now. Women are having more of a role, and HIV, AIDS, and malaria the situation is improving. So there was some good news from Guinea as well.
Now, very quickly, of course, it's Friday. For some, it's thank God it's Friday, but the UN General Assembly continues, right?
It continues tomorrow. We have more speeches all day tomorrow and Monday and Tuesday, so it will continue. Tomorrow there's also a mini summit on Mali. They'll be discussing Mali. And this afternoon there's a high-level meeting on the Central African Republic meant to encourage dialogue in the peace process. So there's still a lot going on here.
Well, Margaret, thank you very much for joining us again today. VOA's UN correspondent Margaret Besheer reporting live from the United Nations.